Hey everybody, this is Hilton Cole back with you again, representing the Guide Right Program and Kappa Alpha Psi. We welcome you to our fifth webinar in our digital series of engaging topics for our Black youth. And we'll continue it with today's State of the Culture 2021 address. So, what is State of the Culture, you might ask? So, you've probably never heard of something like that. Well, think of it like this: the President of the United States has to annually give a State of the Union address in January, where they will declare the State of the Union as it's strong, it's recovering, or whatever adjective that they think is best that describes the condition of the country. What they'll do is then they'll go into details regarding the strengths and accomplishments of the country in in the past year, areas of weakness that we need to sound the alarm on, as well as a forecast of what's going to be on the agenda for the next calendar years that citizens can look forward to from their government. So what we wanted to do was we thought of this interesting concept. Well, we'll take the format of the State of the Union, we'll remix it, and then we'll make it a similar discussion, but cater to the things that we need to do here in the Black community. You know, what were our wins as a culture in the last year? What were the setbacks? What things do we as a culture need to focus on in 2021, as well as the near future? We wanted to cap off Black History Month by doing a little bit of storytelling of our historical journey as a culture to revisit modern history in the past year from the lens of progress, how far we've come, and how far we still have to go, and then talk about how the current generation, Generation Z, who is the first wave is entering adulthood as we speak, can be the torchbearers for this new era. With us, we have four amazing speakers who will introduce themselves momentarily to lead this discussion, as well as give their state of the culture address. We're particularly excited about this slate of speakers as we handpicked one representative from each generation, meaning we'll give a little bit of perspective from the baby boomers who were born before the 60s, Gen Xers who were born before the 80s, and then millennials who were born right before the 2000s started. I'd like to ask that all speakers take an opportunity to introduce themselves to the audience, and we can start with Dr. Hobson.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome, welcome. We are happy to have you here, and I'm happy to be here as well. Again, my name is Mark Hobson. I am a member of Dulles-Leesburg alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi, most proudly. I am also serving as Director of African and African American Studies and Associate Professor of Communication at George Mason University. And so when I was offered this opportunity to participate, I responded for two reasons. One, because I think it's important to help contextualize current events in a way that connects our generations. And I believe that you can't know where you're going until you know where you've been. And two, it is the last day of Black History Month. And I am one who really adamantly celebrates Black History Month. I think it's important, and I wanted to make sure that I was a part of this phenomenal panel. So should I continue or should I wait?
No, I'm gonna allow the other speakers to introduce themselves really quickly. So we'll go next in terms of seniority, Mr. Harvey, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I am Gerald Harvey Jr., and as you've probably guessed, I'm the baby boomer.
Okay, boomer.
I'm a member also of the Dulles-Leesburg alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi, and I'm also honored to be a 50-year member of our fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi. I graduated from Howard University with a degree in mechanical engineering, attended Syracuse University for graduate studies, and received a Master's of Business Administration in Marketing with a sub-concentration in International Finance. I also graduated from the 2-year General Electric Manufacturing Management Program and Executive Training courses. I recently retired from a position as a Vice President of the #1 defense company in the world, Lockheed Martin. And I'll stop there. I only gave you that so that you understand later as I'm talking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Harvey. Then Mr. Wiggins, you can introduce yourself really quickly.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sidney Wiggins III. I'm also a member of Dulles-Leesburg alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. I am a graduate of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. I majored in psychology, got a bachelor's in psychology and a bachelor's in religious and philosophical studies. Went on to go to Marymount University and graduate with a master's in forensic psychology and a master's in counseling psychology. Currently work with the federal government in law enforcement. I work with severely mentally ill individuals that are in the criminal justice system.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Wiggins. And then we'll let our last speaker introduce himself, Mr. Street.
All right, my name is Edward Street. I am a third-year law school student at the Massachusetts School of Law. I'm also a member of the Dulles-Leesburg alumni chapter of Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. I received my bachelor's degree from Michigan State University, and I earned my master's degree in health law and policy from the Maurice A. Dean School of Law at Hofstra University.
I like that. We have a lot of good speakers on the panel, a lot of different experiences from their respective walks of life. Before I give the floor over to Mr. Hobson to get us started, a little bit about the structure of the rest of the time that we'll be spending together. So like I said, I'll turn it over to Mr. Hobson, who will set the tone for this event in his opening address. After that, we'll give 15 to 20 minutes for each of our generation representatives to give their perspective. And then following that, we'll have an open discussion about everything that we talked about and what we need to do after we finish watching this event. At any time, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions to any one of our panelists or to us as a group. We welcome all guests to offer at least one question to give us a dynamic debate, as well as fresh meat for our conversation. Especially for our Kappa Leaguers who are also in the audience as well. We really encourage you all to make sure that you tap into this wealth of wisdom that's on the phone with us right now. I'll do my best job moderating and posting questions to the group. I'll also make sure that we all as a webinar get out of here on time. So with that, I'd like to welcome everybody once more to our State of the Culture webinar, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Hobson to get us started. Mr. Hobson, the floor is yours.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'd like to share a screen first.
You may.
All right, I want to make sure that I have us where we need to be. Are you all able to see the screen?
We are.
Excellent. All right, again, my name is Mark Hobson. I serve as Director of African and African American Studies at George Mason University. When asked to do a short presentation for you all, I decided to contextualize kind of where I think our conversation will go. And so I'm going to move quickly on a few slides here. I welcome any chat, as well as putting my email address in these slides so that you all are able to contact me if you should have a question. But when asked to do this presentation, immediately I thought of the theme Sankofa, and I also thought about Black History Month, and I thought about politics and protests because that's where a lot of young people are today. So in this short presentation, we'll discuss 4 ideas. Again, Sankofa, and within Sankofa, we'll talk a little bit about American slavery quickly, a little bit about Black History Month, politics and protests, and again, my contact information is below if you have questions or comments for me. All right, so again, Sankofa, what does it mean? Well, Sankofa is a Ghanaian word meaning go back and get it. As you can see in the symbol before you, the bird is looking backwards, but the bird is looking backwards in order to gain information for how to move forward. And so as I'm thinking about Sankofa and I'm thinking about this state of the culture, I'm thinking that you all should understand that you will better understand your future when you begin to better understand your past. So again, Sankofa, meaning go back and get it. And I'm hoping that the information I give you today is a look backwards in order to move forward. So when you think about Sankofa in Africa, I want you to remember this. Human life begins in Africa. Everything begins in Africa because the oldest bones, the oldest skeletons are found in Africa, right? So we think about this in terms of Black History Month, but we also think about it in terms of African civilizations dating back to the origins of human existence. So if the oldest skeletons, for example, Lucy, and I would like for you to Google it when you get a chance, Google Lucy, found in East Africa, as well as other skeletons found in Northern Africa, this indicates that also the oldest civilizations, the oldest cultures go back to the motherland, including science, law, art, and language, all of that going back to Africa. So for my young people out there, I want you to remember, whenever you hear stereotypes and exaggerations about the continent of Africa, remember all things begin in Africa. So take pride in that. And also remember this, Africa continues to be one of the richest continents in the world. Gold, diamonds, oil, minerals, and culture all link back to the continent of Africa. And if you don't believe me, hold up your cell phone. And there's a mineral within that cell phone called tantalum. Guess where it's from? It's from Africa. So don't let anybody fool you into thinking that Africa did not produce some of the greatest resources and some of the greatest kings and queens in world history. Now, when you think about world history, I just want you to take a look at this map before you. This is a global map, and certainly the continent of Africa is located in the center. You also probably know that Europe is above Africa in terms of this particular global map, and that what we call the United States is over to your, I'm going to say left in this particular case. But understand this, when we think about African civilizations and we think about this land we call the United States of America, the way in which we came to be includes what we call American slavery, right? American slavery is also considered the African Holocaust, the transatlantic slave trade, so on and so forth. And what I want you to remember about that is this Atlantic Ocean that you see before you. Not only was it used to bring our ancestors to these colonies that would become US America, but that many of our ancestors died within that Atlantic Ocean, right? So there are souls, there are skeletons that still remind us of what we call the transatlantic slave trade. So Sankofa and American slavery, again, notice that I'm using the word American slavery, right? Because it is a part of America's history. So another thing in terms of language is when you consider your ancestors and America's history, never refer to yourselves as slaves, right? Never refer to our ancestors as slaves. These were enslaved human beings, nothing less. We don't objectify, we don't dehumanize, we don't minimize the value of human life. Our ancestors were human beings who were enslaved by enslavers. So don't use the negative language against us, right? Because we were never slaves. Also remember that American slavery occurs largely between 1619 and 1865. Now we know through research that American slavery touched these lands prior to 1619. In fact, some say 1550, and some even argue the late 1400s. But for the sake of our lesson today, you all are probably familiar with Jamestown, who receives its first enslaved Africans in 1619. So if you do the math, that's almost 250 years of legalized slavery. And what I want young people to understand is the way in which legalized slavery helped to create what would become US America. Think about it. What would you do if you had somebody working for you for free for a day? What would you do if you had someone working for you for free for a week? Maybe they would clean your room, cut your grass, do your chores, maybe run errands. Now imagine if you had someone working for you for free for a year. Now imagine how much you could get done in 250 years. So American slavery made US America into the land it is today. And anything great about it needs to be connected to this history of American slavery. And we can't even stop at 1865. We must acknowledge that for the next 100 years after that would be legalized segregation, Jim Crow laws, and straight up racism, all the way through the Civil Rights Bill, right? So even if we think about 1964 and 1965 for the Voting Rights Act, that's another 100 years. So now we're talking about 250 years of legalized slavery and another 100 years of legalized segregation. That's 350 years, you all. Understand the impact this all has on where we are today. America isn't even 350 years old yet. So let's think about that. Consider this: American slavery brought great wealth to Britain and the American colonies through cotton and tobacco crops. Literally had to cut down trees and clear out the land so these things could make America one of the most wealthy places in the world. And if you don't believe me, look around and I bet within arm's reach, you have cotton. Either you're wearing it or someone near you is wearing it. As a matter of fact, these colonies, what became US America, was also called King Cotton for a long time. Now, I want to move into Black History Month after that quick discussion of American slavery, because I want you to understand why Black History Month came into being. There are so many scholars to recognize and discuss, but today we're just going to start on Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was a visionary, all right? Dr. Carter G. Woodson was the original definition of being woke or an influencer. He is the founder of African American studies, in addition to people like W.E.B. Du Bois and others who create ways of studying the Black experience. Dr. Carter G. Woodson is also the second African American to graduate from Harvard after W.E.B. Du Bois. He is a historian, he's an educator, he's a dean at Howard University at one time. And he also founded what was called the Journal of Negro History. So he did a lot of writing and research around the Black experience. And one of the things I want to leave you with is this. He wrote this book called The Miseducation of the Negro. And you should read it by the time you get to college. By the time you get to college, you should read it if you want to consider yourself woke. But within that book is this quote where Woodson says, if you can determine what a man will think, you will not need to determine what he will do. And so what he's talking about is the colonizing of the mind. In other words, we knew American slavery was to take control of the Black body, but it also took control of the Black mind. And Carter G. Woodson came along in the early 1900s and said, hey, one of the ways that we will free ourselves is if we free our minds. And so he was always about educating Black people about their own greatness and also looking to educate the world about Black greatness. So in 1926, he starts what's called a Negro History Week. And this is his effort to show you all the great contributions that Black people have made to not only US America, but to the world. And keep this in mind, Negro History Week was started in February in relationship to the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. So this week is symbolic of a whole lot of stuff, even in terms of the word Black, because Carter G. Woodson uses Black as a proper noun in referencing people, race, and culture. And so we need to look at ourselves as a proper noun, as important anytime we talk about ourselves, because we know that knowledge is power. Now keep this in mind. Carter G. Woodson began what was called Negro History Week in 1926, and he was hoping that he would be able to educate Black people, and indeed all people, to shake off what he called the mental chains. But in 1970, college students at Kent State University organized to create a Black History Month. They wanted more time to talk about these achievements. They understood how important it was to have these discussions. And by 1976, President Gerald R. Ford urged the nation to recognize the accomplishments of Black Americans in every field of human endeavor. So when you think about Black History Month, remember this: it reminds us about our ancestors and the significant contributions they've made to the world. Many people understand this, but some people don't. Some people don't necessarily know this information, therefore they don't see it as important, right? Every school should be teaching this information, and I would hope that every teacher would want to be knowledgeable around this information. We need to recognize our ancestors' contributions, and we also need to raise awareness about the real US American history out there, Black History Month is US American history, all right? And with all this talk these days about social justice, Black History Month is all about social justice. It's all about breaking those mental chains, and it's about restoration, restoring Black people to a place of pride, humanity, and restoring those things that were lost through 350 years of oppression. So be sure to tell your friends and your peers that Black History Month is American history. It's about today. It's about understanding that racism is not a figment of our imagination. It's also about the reality that students will graduate sometimes from high school and even college with little to no knowledge of the African American journey. It's also about civil rights and economic justice. It reminds us about Sojourner Truth, who's there in the bottom left of your screen, who's an activist, an abolitionist, a suffragist. It also reminds us about Frederick Douglass, who's also a suffragist, an abolitionist, an educator, right? He also wrote this piece that you need to understand where he asked the question, what to the Negro was the 4th of July, right? He asked this question in response to patriotism around a country who needs to realize and recognize the value of Black people, right? And even Sojourner Truth, I should say to you all, Sojourner Truth has a poem or a speech, I should say, that you all need to become aware of. And she asked the question of, ain't I a woman? So sometimes you're going to hear words like intersectionality, where people are talking about race and gender and class. Sojourner Truth was one of the original scholars of intersectionality. All right, so let's give her due credit. And many of you may know the person on the right, that is Amanda Gorman. You all recall Amanda Gorman, right? Amanda Gorman is the award-winning writer, graduated cum laude, graduate of Harvard University, where she studied sociology. And she came in during the inauguration, presidential inauguration, with this poem called The Hill We Climb. And so I take this quote from the poem because I want you all to understand how powerful it is and how powerful young people can be. And so Gorman says in the poem, we've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. And so I ask you all the rhetorical question, what does it mean when she says a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished? I suggest to you that many of you knew what it meant, which is why you were out in the streets or why you took some position during the summer of 2020, right? We know that after the murder of George Floyd, people wanted to become active to change the world for the better. And so young people have always been a part of these social movements. I need you to understand that, not only from the images that you see that represent where we are today, right? The state of the culture today, but look in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Right there is an image that represents young people from a while ago. So when we think about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, and others, these protests have always gone on. Politics and protests have always been a part of our culture because protest is voice and politics has to do with resources. So one day, 4 young men sat in seats in a segregated diner in Greensboro, North Carolina. They were asked to move because of segregation, but they refused to move and they insisted on being treated like citizens. Now, let me give you one other fact. Here's another reason why they refused to move. They refused to move because 5 years earlier, there was the murder of Emmett Till, who was the Trayvon Martin of his time. In 1955, Emmett Till was 14 years old when he went to visit his family in Money, Mississippi. One day he started joking around in a store where the owner accused him of having a smart mouth. Now, how many young people have smart mouths? I know I might have been a smart mouth person back in my day, and certainly some of us on the line have smart mouths. But this is the difference. What happened to this young Black man was he was accused of having a smart mouth, and he went home, and 2-3 days later, the store owner's husband and brother came to get him. They came to get him. They took him out. They beat him. They killed him. And he became known as a young black man who died due to racism, but who also helped to ignite what we call the civil rights movement. So think about this in terms of where we are today. Emmett Till is killed in 1955. In 1960, those 4 young men sitting at that counter decide they're going to do something about this. They're going to do something to change the world. They're known as the Greensboro Four. Their sit-ins would inspire 300 students to join their protests. But they also inspired something called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Raleigh, North Carolina, better known as SNCC. Now, if you do your research, you'll understand that SNCC helped to co-organize the Freedom Rides of the South, the 1963 March on Washington, and they also pushed for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. These are all young people. This is what you all are doing today. And their chairperson, a person by the name of Stokely Carmichael, better known as Kwame Ture today, he called for a Black Power movement or Black Liberation Movement, BLM. You all know what BLM stands for today, right? You all call it Black Lives Matter. So the connections are there. In 2020, you all are doing the same things that we were doing and they were doing decades ago. So I want you to understand where you are is a part of a larger context or a part of a larger movement. You didn't get woke without somebody waking you, is my point. So when you think about politics, protests, and social justice, and I'm coming to my end here, I know my time is running short, understand this. Social justice is about restoring and repairing what's been broken through American slavery and racism. Social justice is about telling the truth, and it also requires that we recognize and we learn from history. Because without something like Black History Month, we wouldn't know that in 1887, Alexander Miles patented the automatic elevator door after his daughter almost fell through an elevator shaft. We wouldn't know that in 1923, Garrett Morgan patented the yellow light as a warning signal for drivers because he was one of the first African Americans in Cleveland to own an automobile, and he realized that they weren't stopping in time to avoid accidents. We wouldn't know that in 1988, Dr. Patricia Bath patented a laser device to remove cataracts because of the way it was impacting Black communities. And we wouldn't know that in 1992, Mae Jemison became the first African American woman to travel into space, which is symbolic that there is no limit to where you can go. So understand this again, Sankofa means that history impacts us today. Understand that Black History Month is an important part of American history. Understand that Black people continue to make great contributions to the world, including you, and that Black History Month and social justice are about restoration and responsibility. And this, my friends, is the power of politics and protests. Thank you.
Dr. Hobson, thank you so much for setting the tone of today's event. Thank you so much for taking us on a tour throughout history. We definitely are in a historic age right now. We went through a lot in 2020. What's going on now with coronavirus, with the Black Lives Matter protests, with the shifting of the narrative is going to be something that's going to be remembered forever. I'm really glad that those down the call, the majority of our audience of those of Generation Z, are going to be the primary beneficiaries of the actions that we're doing today, and that pretty soon that they're going to be picking up that torch and then leading this charge for their kids and their grandkids. Considering everything, Mr. Street, that our culture has been through in America, Dr. Hobson articulated it through history and definitely in the last year, from European colonization to American slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights movement, and now the Black Lives Matter movement. What, in your opinion, as a fellow millennial, somebody who was born before 2000, what, in your opinion, is the state of the culture right now from your perspective?
Well, first and foremost, I will say that for the record, I'll admit that being the next person to speak after Mr. Harpson is a bit intimidating.
That's why I jumped in.
Mr. Hobson is very gifted in the art of speech, and I've been trying to emulate him for the past 8 years since I've known him. But I will say thank you, Mr. Cole, for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. As I said before, my name is Edward Street. I'm a third-year law school student, and from my perspective, the state of the culture for millennials like myself is dynamic, right? Primarily because in many ways, it's still based on the goal of becoming or being woke, as Mr. Hobson mentioned. And of course, when I say woke, I'm talking about not only knowledge of self, but of your surroundings. But I will say, and I think this is important, that because millennials as a group include individuals between the ages of 25 and 40, there's going to be some differences in opinion on this topic. However, I think it's important to note that as a group, we represent your new generation of rising professionals, whether we're talking about the business world or sports and music entertainment and even theater. And so we are literally the face of the culture right now. But I think that 2020 was a real wake up for Black millennials, especially if we're talking about the pandemic and issues related to social injustice. And I think that's primarily because 2020, and I guess you could say life in general, has, as Brother Hobson once explained to me, kind of forced us to acknowledge the reality of our own mortality. And sometimes that's not always the easiest thing to do for people who still consider themselves relatively young. But at the same time, it's like, how can we not? In 2020 alone, we lost key figures in our community, real role models, even victims of police brutality. We lost Kobe Bryant, John Lewis, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Katherine Johnson, as well as, and unfortunately, some of our immediate and extended members of our family and friends. And so I think that with respect to the state of the culture, at least through the eyes of millennials, I think the realities of the past have given us a sense of urgency. And that is extremely important because that's where I believe we are right now, because we saw that sense of urgency, right, with the rise and the expansion of the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw that sense of urgency when Black folks came out in record numbers to vote in the general presidential election and in the runoff elections in Georgia. And so I think that while the hardships, and the progress that we make in the face of adversity are really what creates our culture, or any culture for that matter, I think it's equally important for us to identify the things that we need to do to sustain and build. And that's why I think in 2020, we saw such a rise in the whole stay woke movement in a number of ways. For example, okay, I'm a huge fan of independent films and documentaries. And I did a little bit of Googling last night, or as we millennials like to call research these days. And I noticed that in 2020 alone, there were a significant amount of, or a significant increase in the number of Black films that were released and promoted, right? And I may be wrong, but I attribute that to the whole stay woke movement. And I hope that we continue to push that, because it's not going to get done until we do it. And Mr. Cole, I don't mean to jump the gun by any means, but I would like to say something about generation heroes, right? So my generation's heroes, of course, this is from my perspective, are really the foundation of our culture, because they really nurtured millennials like ourselves to become who we are right now. They're what I call hidden figures. And I definitely stole that title. I'm not going to lie. I completely bit that title. But realistically, they are hidden figures, because I think while most people would probably name an athlete or an actor or a politician, right? I honestly think that our generation's heroes were our teachers and our family. You know, the things that we easily take for granted, but we can't necessarily do without. And so, Mr. Cole, did you have any other questions? I know I'm ending my segment a little early compared to the amount of time you gave me to speak, but if not, then I will say thank you for having me.
No problem at all. We really do appreciate the millennial perspective. I know that some of the parents or some of the older members of our audience might try to group millennials and Generation Z into the same bucket, but we're completely two different classes of people. I was reading something in McKinsey, one of the biggest consulting firms in America. They all say that some of the core Generation Z behaviors is all anchored in a similar element, which is the search for the truth. So you mobilize yourselves for a variety of different causes. You know, you have access to the data. You can make decisions. So give me a second. You make decisions based on a wealth of information and data and facts and understanding of your world that prior generations haven't had. I think that, you know, when you look at TV or when you look at your social media feeds, you look at all the publicly available information that's out there on online, you know, you get a pretty interesting understanding of, you know, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, who was caught in the middle, and then you get a, you know, thorough understanding of what needs to be done in order to make sure that everyone has an equitable future. I think this, you know, it was really powerful seeing like all the protests last year. It was really powerful seeing, you know, the millennials driving that, but it was really the most powerful seeing the Generation Z generation, you know, just accepting it as normal. Normal in the sense that, hey, just because you have a different skin color as me doesn't mean that you're better or worse than me. Hey, there's bigger problems that we as a country face right now. We need to unite. We need to love each other. We need to engage in dialogue and speak with one another. So we're having more dynamic. I like what that word that you used earlier. We're having more dynamic conversations with one another. We're having more dynamic thoughts about what can be done into the future. I think we're going to see a lot of dynamic solutions, and you know, the businesses that we support and the elected officers that we put into office, to the kind of people that we entertain in our lives. You know, like I said, the whole narrative is shifting right now, and it's really interesting to see that as somebody who's, and you know, I'm in my 20s, but Mr. Street's in his 30s. It's really interesting to see that that wasn't just the case, you know, just 15 years ago, where we're able to have those kind of dynamic discussions.
Absolutely.
All right, so thank you so much, Mr. Street. I did have one question for you before we moved on. So, what do you think our biggest opportunity for the future is, from your perspective as a millennial?
Um, so I think we have an opportunity to continue to use technology for the benefit of our people, and not just our people, of course, our culture as well. For example, I would love to see another social media platform dedicated to us. I know we all, at least most of us, may recall Black Planet. Um, but I think that's something that we need to consider. And it doesn't need to be necessarily limited, but it needs to be dedicated to us so that we can have a place for our news, our voice, our concerns, and whatever else, children, adults, what have you. So that's one of the key opportunities that I think we have right now.
Awesome, awesome. So thank you so much, Mr. Street. We'll bring you back in when we have our roundtable discussion. Now we want to go a little bit further back. We'll speak to somebody from the Generation X generation who give his perspective on the same timeline that Mr. Street and Dr. Hobson shared with you guys. So from your perspective, Mr. Wiggins, you know, what is the state of the culture as you see it right now?
Again, good afternoon. I may be, I believe that the state of the culture is in flux.
In
I
flux.
say that because we have um, the young people that are out there doing a lot of great work. They're active. You have my generation that did our work. We did work as best as we could, and we are the children of the civil rights parents. My parents were around during the civil rights movement. My father was at Fisk during the civil rights movement, and Fisk in Nashville is a major city that took where a lot of the movement took place. And actually, I got at my desk right here, I got the Solo on Ice I've been going back through and reading. I think that while, from my perspective, the work that the young men and women are doing now is inspiring. But I believe for me and some of my generation, we've become jaded, unfortunately, to whatever progress may take place. We know that it can happen. We've been preaching it. We've had it preached to us over and over again. Like Brother Harvey and my father and his father before him. My parents are very involved in the community. And so I look at things not so much as, I would like things to happen on a broader scale, but I try to focus on the small circle. I focus on my home and what I can instill in my home and have those trees spread seeds outside of the home, and hopefully it can build a forest. I believe it's an influx because while I understand the motivation of some of the woke movement, and I respect it, and I think there's some excellent work being done. I feel like a lot of times the goalpost gets moved back and forth, and there's no direct. It gets confusing as far as what the actual end game is, and I think that if we could, and I also believe that social media plays a big part in it, both good and bad, because you have outlets for us to communicate, Facebook, Instagram, and all that stuff. And there's some good stuff there, but then there's also, just like there's also the algorithms. So they find out what you want to know more about, and they feed you more of that over and over again. So you're not getting a broader perspective and more insight into what the left or what the right or what the middle is what their insights are, what their perspectives may be. You're just getting fed back what you like to eat. So until we can nail down what it is that we want to happen, and justice, yes, I understand justice. We want justice. We all want justice. We want people held accountable. But then we have, and that's a solid goal in my eye. But we also have and it also leads into some of the cancel culture aspect of what takes place, where someone that may have been doing great work or doing great work, and they have a misstep or a sound bite of some sort, and all of a sudden whatever they did or said is no good anymore.
Right.
I'm from the generation where we learned from our previous generation that you're going to say things, you're going to do things. If we look at some of our leaders from the past, I'm not going to go into specifics, they've had some less than desirable things, activities connected to them. But that does not negate what it is that they do, what that they have done for our people and for society as a whole, because it wasn't necessarily just because of just for Blacks or minorities, but it was for the poor. I would like for us to have a more focused, well, let me back up a bit.
You got it.
I believe that there's a separation between the boomers, Generation X, and the millennials, which is probably why we have all three on the panel right now.
Yep.
And it's part of getting those, finding common. It's almost like having Democrats and Republicans. You know, we both want, they both may want to have the country go forward. They want everybody to be prosperous, so to speak, whatever that may look like. But their views on how to get there may look different.
Right.
And one is not willing to budge, may not be willing to budge on how to get there. And by the time you go back and forth fussing about it, 10, 20, 30 years have gone by and not much has changed at all.
Right.
And so for my generation, we've seen all of that. We've been up, but when I was at Fisk, I went down to Selma. We had there was a mayoral race. And I was down there poll watching, going door to door, getting folks to come out because the incumbent mayor was white and he had blatant racist advertisements, and the challenger was black. It was a black man, Kappa man, and we were down there poll watching for him. And so we've been down there. We've been doing things. We've been working, but we over and over again, we don't see the same result. We don't see the results we want to see. So I believe for our generation, we get cynical. And that's where, unfortunately, not for me, but unfortunately, we get, you hear the folks talking about my vote doesn't matter, it doesn't count, who cares, and so on and so forth. And I feel like we, inside of Generation X, we have that battle going on as well. I'm not of that mindset. I'm of the mindset of, again, you work on your local level and you build out. But unfortunately, like what Brother Street alluded to, he said that generation, millennials learned from the previous generation, the older, what I always considered like the older brother, older sister syndrome. Whereas, you know, you may have a brother that's 3 or 4 years older, he's able to do things you're not able to do. And so you watch them and you see what they do and you try to do what you think that they were doing. But at some point, that process gets messed up. And so and what happens is it replicates itself over and over again and spreads out. So for example, if you have a look at it as a cell in the body. If you have a cell that is ill, the other cells can replicate that, and that illness can spread throughout the body. Well, if it's not being checked, if you follow. So when I look at what we did back in the day, we did a lot of great things, we did a lot of dumb things. And so I see the kids now that are doing things that were foolish to us back then, even more foolish to me now, and trying to do the same things that we did, what they thought that we were doing, and ended up getting themselves in even worse trouble than we would have.
Right.
And it's I take blame. I believe some of our generation takes blame for that, because we weren't properly teaching and we were, you know, flying by the seat of our pants in some cases. But I believe that, again, like I believe the state of the culture right now is in flux. I would love to see more work on mental health. I would love to see more natural normalization on going to see your therapist, like you go to see your doctor, go to see your physician, or going to see your dentist, or at the very bare minimum going to see your dentist, where you may go every 6 months, but even though you need to go more than that, because we grew up in a time where we learned from the previous generation that you don't talk about what's going on in the house or with you outside of the house. And so what happens is we internalize that doesn't get checked, that doesn't get discussed. And so so it takes us all this time to start talking about what mental health means to us and how it can be beneficial. So I would like to see more normalization of receiving mental health or seeking out counseling. I've worked in treatment for a long time. When someone is in residential treatment for substance abuse or anything else, they may go there for 30, 60, 90 days or however long. But when they leave from there, prior to them leaving there, they need to be set up for transitional, be it outpatient services. So they're not just going out into the wild by themselves without any tools. I say that to say this: when you're in school, or when I was in school, elementary school, middle school, high school, we had counselors that we would talk to that were available to us. I believe that that needs to be sustained, or at least have kids prepared to sustain that beyond the K through 12 system. So that if you're in middle school, if you're in high school, your counselor may be able to refer you to, or have options to connect you to other services beyond, so that you can still maintain mental health or therapeutic services. In addition to, I believe, Brother Cole, Mr. Cole, you've talked about it before. This is a different subject as far as financial
Literacy.
literacy. Yes.
Yep.
Starting in middle school, high school, learning how to use money, preparing for retirement before you even retire, before you even start your job.
Right.
Learning how to manage your money before you have to figure out where the next dollar is going to come from to pay for that bill. So there's a lot of things going on in the community. There's a lot of great things going on in the culture right now. And I would love to see more of it, but I think it's just a matter of organizing, as it always is. We always talk about, we got to organize, we got to do this, we got to do that. But it's also going to take a lot of humility on all sides, because my generation thought we knew it all. Our parents don't think that we know anything, and so on and so forth. When it goes down to the millennials, a lot of times we say, well, they don't know what they're talking about. They're just doing, they just listening to the Lil Yachty and out there messing around. But it's I think that there's a finding the midway would be beneficial, and I think that the influx is not necessarily a bad thing. Let me also say that, because it means that there is a tectonic shift taking place. Now, if it's going to be a beneficial one, we need to hop on it right now. Just like with the BLM and the protests last year, or that continue to go on. People are paying attention. So if you're going to do something, you doggone better well do it now and take advantage of it, because this may not happen or have the opportunity to do this again anytime soon. And if it doesn't happen, what you will end up having is a lot of folks in my generation being cynical, because we had all this opportunity, we did all this rah-rah, but we didn't stick to our guns and follow through with what it was we were talking about, with what it is we were trying to do. And I'll back up.
Mr. Wiggins, you said several interesting points. I actually wrote down several questions for you. I'll try my best to get through the most interesting ones. We really do appreciate you giving your perspective from a Gen X point of view. So I asked the same question to Mr. Street. What's our biggest opportunity for the future? And before you answer, just a little bit of context. I was doing a little bit of research earlier on Generation Z, and what I found was that Generation Z are big supporters of conscious capitalism. So they'll only purchase and they'll only invest in businesses that are moving the needle progressively, both for social issues like the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen this with Nike, as well as the environment. So I guess what's our biggest opportunity for Gen Z to use their dollars and then to use their influence on social media in order to make an impact?
Just to continue doing that. Part of it, you start to see the way, I believe part of why the quote unquote cancel culture has been so impactful is because that these big businesses are aware that if you don't put your money into those products, or then something needs to be, they're gonna have to change. They're gonna have to change. You got Disney firing people for making comments that were inflammatory.
Yep.
Because folks were like, no, I'm going to cancel. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to continue to give you my money if you don't do X, Y, or Z. So, I mean, that's part of it, I believe, you know.
I think it's really interesting how in the beginning of social media, I'm young enough to remember in the beginning of Instagram and Twitter and hashtag activism, where you do hashtag Black Lives Matter or hashtag stop the shooting or whatever that it is. You know, it was frowned upon because people would say, hey, you know, posting on social media doesn't really make a difference. It's not the same as, say, being out in the streets, being in front of the United States Capitol or the White House or your local state capital or whatever. But if you really look at how social media works and how hashtags work, you know, posting a single hashtag Black Lives Matter movement and then attaching it to a powerful image, you know, as an opportunity to reach everyone across the entire internet, everyone who's on that social media platform. You know, if you go and protest, the media will cover it for one or two news cycles and then they'll move on to something else. Whereas it seems like, you know, with this hashtag activism that Generation Z, they do have an opportunity to not only um, have a stance on what they feel, but also sustain it. We've seen this with Black Lives Matter. We've seen this with Me Too. We've seen this with a lot of other movements. So that's something I think was really interesting as well. I'm going to ask a similar question. So I asked, what was the biggest opportunity for Gen Z? You said that Gen X was a little bit more cynical. You know, some of the momentum died down a little bit. My perspective is now that Generation X is taking the power over from the baby boomers, now that you're in the proverbial catbird seat, like Vice President Kamala Harris is a Gen Xer. There's a lot of people in Capitol Hill and CEOs that are Gen Xers. Now that you have the power, now that you have the money, now that you have the influence from a top-down perspective, what can Gen X do to get back in the game?
Well, just to be very clear, I'm only 5 days removed from being a millennial. So I wouldn't necessarily put myself in the category in the same company as uh, Vice President Harris and others in Congress. But I believe that if we can utilize the resources that we have, the people, the connections that we have. When I was younger, when I was a kid growing up, I grew up here, as most of you all know, I grew up in Sterling, and it looks a lot different. And I always thought about, man, it'd be cool to actually know somebody that could do something, somebody of that was in power, somebody that was influential. And as I grew older, I've become kind of, I've learned and met people that I'm proud to know. And I like to encourage those people to continue to influence as best they can and not frivolously use it, because it's very important. It's very
You got it.
You can't waste it. You can't. You don't have any opportunities, so you have to use it while you can.
Right.
So.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, Mr. Wiggins, thank you so much for giving your perspective. We'll bring you back in the group conversation, and we'll go ahead and move on. So to our OG that's on the line, Mr. Gerald Harvey, he's seen the most out of everyone on the call, out of, I think, everyone that's in the audience as well. I really like to give his perspective on what he thinks the state of the culture is right now in 2021, what things that we've overcome recently, as well as what things that we need to look at into the future. So, Mr. Harvey. You might be on mute, good brother. Give me a second. There you go, Mr. Harvey. Let me try it again.
How's that?
That's much better. We can hear you now.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to take some personal privilege and everybody's time.
You got it.
And everybody's time who they haven't used.
Okay.
Because I think it's important, especially for the young men, and if we have some young women also on the line, to understand that how we got here, what happened, what's the background that is leading to today? You asked me the question about the state of the culture. I think I have not 2 words, but 2 lines. Number one, I would say that we're a work in progress.
Okay.
It's and you'll get the sense of that, I think, as I go through this. And the other part that is more optimistic is I would say that we are a revitalized culture. What I have seen in the past year among our young and among our people gives me a sense of hope. You know, a sense of hope that I haven't had since probably the 70s. And we can talk about that as I told Brother Cole or Mr. Cole earlier, as when we can get together and be face to face and sit in small groups, we can talk about some of those things. But I think we're revitalized and we are a work in progress. Let me tell you a little bit. I'm gonna give you some history, and Dr. Hobson talked a little bit. In fact, I could probably steal one of his slides to go through a lot of what I'm going to talk about. I grew up in the North, New York State, Buffalo, New York. So New York did not experience the Jim Crow laws and the Jim Crow-ism that many of the people south of the Mason-Dixon line did. It considered itself to be a progressive society, but it was very far from it, anything. Its neighborhoods, schools, services, employment opportunities were separated by race. And that was ongoing. That was not a myth. This separation was born in the aftermath of World War II and the Korean War. Returning white soldiers and their families were supported in the development of housing, educational, and job opportunities by government programs that were not readily available to Black families. That's important. You need to understand the government, the United States government supported white families in the development of housing, the tract housing, the development of education, and the development of job opportunities. Housing assistance was provided to white families in tract homes. It wasn't Lennar, but it was Ryan that built those homes that were, every one of them, hundreds of them looked alike. But that provided an opportunity for white families to get in to homes. Those were not afforded to us. Housing assistance for Blacks were concentrated in the cities, in these large monstrosities that were called projects. You know, some of the ones that are probably most familiar to the people on the phone are things like the Cabrini projects in Chicago. In Buffalo, we had a whole section of town that was built of these 20-story buildings built under a bridge where thousands of Black families and lower income families were expected to live. Services in these areas and other middle-class neighborhoods were substandard. Transportation, the way you get around, the way you're able to get a job, get an education, were scarce in these areas. The social life for Black families consisted primarily of our music, our sports, following the teams that we could not attend the games for because we could not afford it, and the Black church. Middle-class neighborhoods, which I was fortunate enough to live in, were tight. We watched over one another. You've heard Hillary Clinton talk about a village raising children. We had that in that if I strayed, some lady sitting out on her porch down at the end of the block had called my mom, told her about it, and my mom was waiting on the porch for me when I got home. and knew everything was going on. We looked after each other. As the economic times began to change and the blue collar industries, where most of the middle class in the North was employed, that was their hiring opportunity. These businesses began to close down and fail. In the riots that happened in some of these areas were looted, burned to the ground. The horror of this, and I can attest to each of this, is that the horror of this is the continuing racism and the prejudice that has kept many of these areas from ever being rebuilt. They're still hollow shells of their former glory. Jefferson Avenue in Buffalo, New York is an excellent example. It runs for about 5 miles from the Dulles-Leesburg campus, and on one end all the way downtown into what we call the Fruit Belt. Pretty much all still 2 years ago when I was home, isolated. During this time, and I'm still talking about the time that I was in elementary school and secondary school, the country was undergoing a change. Much of it was being brought about by a group of young college students, many of which are the same age as the Kappa Leaguers that we have on this call. The civil rights movement essentially started in the 50s. I got to see it as a young kid through the church, through my parents. And it started with the actions of people like Rosa Parks, who we all know. And there were many, many others that are not as familiar, who started the Montgomery bus boycott, the Little Rock Nine, who opened up the Central High School in Little Rock to Blacks. More than a year on the Montgomery bus boycott. Can you imagine, and I'm not trying to be cynical here, but can you imagine Black people keeping to anything for a year? I think it was somewhat 390 days that the bus boycott in Montgomery went on until the Supreme Court eventually ruled that segregated seating on buses was unconstitutional. And in Arkansas, Governor Faubus, I believe that it was his name, deployed the National Guard troops to stop these 9 children from attending school. It took the President of the United States, a former general and war hero, President Eisenhower, to send federal troops in to escort these students back and forth to school. These are the images that those of us that were fortunate enough to begin to have televisions in our home were seeing. This is what we were reading in our newspapers and seeing the hate of America towards African Americans and other people of color. The 50s had been what I'll call conservative war recovery years. The federal government was providing for the soldiers, as I told you, with housing. And they went as far as to have codicils in the lending documents that said that they could not sell, could not lend to African Americans. Those were documents that were in federal documents. That's the type of country we were living in the 50s, 60s. What did this bring about? This brought about a separation in the wealth of the two classes of people. White America was able to establish itself in housing, in homes, its economic growth during that time frame. I don't know the percentages, but it was considerably greater than African Americans because real estate, as you know, is part of the equation. We did not have that opportunity. The results were that white families had the greatest building of personal wealth in the history of our country after World War II and the Korean War. In our large cities, near the transportation hubs, and when I say transportation hubs, I'm talking about the emerging interstate highway system. I'm talking about the rivers, the St. Lawrence Seaway and things like that in the northern, which was how goods were moved in the late 60s and 70s. In that time, we had a manufacturing boom. Blacks and whites were able to work side by side during the day in the auto stamping plants, in the flour mills, in places like that. But at the end of the day, the blacks returned to much different environments than what the whites were going through. Blacks tended to be laid off as the manufacturing cycles turned. We as children in the neighborhoods, we saw all this. I'm using my personal background because I'm sure that this was seen by others in other parts of the country. The 60s were basically the embodiment of the civil rights movement. With the rise of student involvement, there were student-led sit-ins by students from Southern HBCUs. You saw that in Dr. Hobson's pitch. He showed you the counter in the Woolworth store where blacks were not allowed to sit. They would never get served, but these 4 students went and sat and refused to leave until they were removed. And then we had the freedom rides that became a major initiative on the landscape. These were led by students, young people, names that you know. Marion Barry, the former mayor of the District of Columbia. James Clyburn, current majority leader in the Congress. Stokely Carmichael, a Howard University graduate, and the beloved John Lewis, who was one of the first freedom riders. Early on in the 60s, Black college students took a stand against segregation and whites-only facilities, such as transportation facilities, bus lines. You couldn't ride an interstate bus from the north to Mississippi because you were not allowed to do that if you were an African American. One of the results was the formation of SNCC. Dr. Hobson talked about that, to encourage more students to join the movement. In 1961, I believe it was, the Freedom Riders started the first bus trip from here in Washington, D.C. to make a tour of the bus terminals throughout the South to test the Supreme Court ruling on the unconstitutionality of segregated transportation facilities in the South. The tour faced violence from both police and white protesters everywhere. Eventually, the first bus was bombed and burned out in Alabama. The people that were on that bus were lucky to get out with their lives, and then they almost got beat to death by the protesters. This began something that was key to the movement. It began the international attention to what was going on. Freedom rides were conducted, many throughout that summer in the early 60s, to build this awareness. Another that that was important was the one to Jackson, Mississippi, where the bus riders were arrested for 30 days because they were trespassing in what was called a whites-only facility, that being the bus station. During the same time, we realized the power of the vote to change things. Voter registration, as it is today, became the focus in many areas. Much like today, it was a key movement. But at that time, many of those organizers and voters were the subject of violence. There's a theme here. For those of you that did not live it, violence was the way. And I haven't even talked about the major issues like the Pettus Bridge and other things like that. But violence was the way that whites tried to stop us. And today, although we don't have the violence, we suffer from other creative voter suppression schemes. You're all familiar with those. I'm not going to outline those. Brother Cole, that is probably one of the things that I'm going to say we have to work on. We can't wait until 2022.
Right.
This shiggity is started and already is in place. And if we sit back, we will be a victim of it in 2022. From 1965 to 1968, as I was in high school, we had 3 pieces of legislation which were critical to the progress of the Black agenda. Number 1, we had the Civil Rights Act, signed in 1964, which was intended, that's a purposeful word, it was intended to guarantee equal employment for all. In 1965, a year later, the Voting Rights Act extended that Civil Rights Act by banning voter literacy tests and providing monitors, much like we have today, to look over elections in certain voting jurisdictions. It's key that Congress came back when that law expired and did not reinitiate that, and that's one of the things we're fighting now. And then the third was the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which prevents housing discrimination based on race, sex, religion, other preferences. Counterbalancing these successes were the horror of Bloody Sunday. I think this is one of the things that is still taught in the schools, so many of our Kappa Leaguers know about it, at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which was televised. Something that I was remembering as I was putting my bullets together here was while I was in school, one of the things that was very popular was a song called "The Revolution Will Be Televised." And I went back and Googled that and played it for myself a little bit last night. But seeing the horror of Bloody Sunday really helped the civil rights movement. And it was how it turned the opinions of the world against the white police and supremacists. The other events, which I'm sure you're all aware of, was in that same time frame, we lost Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King. Protests continued by students at HBCUs and other schools. I mentioned HBCUs, I'll try to tie it up in the end. Many of these ended in violence, such as the Orangeburg Massacre at South Carolina State, where protesters were protesting segregation at a local bowling alley. They couldn't go off campus to a bowling alley. Armed state police in South Carolina opened fire on the students on campus. They weren't in the bowling alley, they were on campus where they should have been protected. Killed 3 male students, one of which was a high school student who hadn't even been involved in those protests at the bowling alley, and injuring many other students. The early 70s were an extension of this involvement of the 60s. Campus protests intended to focus on anti-war efforts primarily, as opposed to segregation. We had the Jackson State killings, where armed police opened fire on protesting students once again on campus. Our parents sent us to schools where we should have been safe. They came on campus, opened fire on the campus, killed 2 students, and injured another 12. This was only about 5 weeks after Kent State's riots, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students protesting the war in Cambodia. Other student-led protests at HBCUs like Howard were to make changes in the administration, to be more aware, what we would call woke today, as to what was happening in the United States. I got to participate in one of those my freshman year. I remember being tear gassed once again by National Guardsmen out on the quad. I remember being tear gassed another night when we were in the Fine Arts building because we were sitting in, because we did not believe that the school was doing the proper things. We eventually got the president to resign. However, it was a very traumatic time to take a look at. These things began to dissipate near the end of the 70s. There wasn't as much protest on campus. Students weren't involved. The voter registration campaigns became more localized. That's where I say we're a work in progress. I think we need to return to a lot of those things. I want to talk a little bit for a second, because I think this is really what you wanted. Professional life. I've been very fortunate. I grew up, I went to a fantastic school, and in my professional life, I have had opportunities that many others have not. You know, I've worked the gambit from technical opportunities as an engineer. I worked on some of our country's, I'll just say I worked with some of the smartest people that this country has to offer. And I ended up my career spending most of my time in the halls of Congress, working with the members of the House and Senate and their staffs. I've seen this country from all perspectives. I've seen the blatant racism that we have, and that's where I get my revitalized thought, because I think the fact that we're now beginning to understand how racist this country still is, and how we as a people need to get in the streets, get involved in everything from government to social aspects to our school boards, everything. We need to get out and begin to control. In corporate America, we're beginning to see some movement. I've been, very pleased that we're beginning to see Blacks in C-suite. We're also beginning to see Blacks in senior leadership jobs. It ebbs and flows. I was talking with one of my former colleagues about this same subject about a month ago. And we were talking about using my alma mater, Lockheed Martin. At one point, we were in this town looked up to because we had African Americans in vice president, senior vice president, and executive vice president levels. Then we baby boomers began to retire. And those numbers have gone to minuscule levels. And you have to ask the question, why? We've had the same experiences. We've damn sure done the same job, and we've done it well and better than many of our colleagues. But why are we not getting those opportunities? I talk about that also at a later date. Let's talk about the technology.
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to start off as a young engineer in the laboratories, dealing with, cloud snow, discrimination from satellite photos, things like that, working on search algorithms. I'm really amazed from the time that I was working on a project for an agency to put together a search engine that we were putting together massive farms of IBM computers. And I now think of what we now have in our hands, on our phones, on our wristwatches, with regard to that same search capability. And the fact that we can all get it from a Google or somebody like that. You've seen a transformation of technology in the last 40 years that this country has never seen before, and it continues to grow. I advocate each of the Kappa Leaguers out there to take a hard look at STEM. You'll never regret it. You'll never regret getting a scientific background. And, I never was out of a job for a day in my professional life of 44 years, nor was I ever really threatened, because there was always something that I knew somebody could use that I knew. Get that STEM education. I'll also say, go to an HBCU. You will never regret that. You can go to an HBCU for your undergraduate education and go to any graduate school in the world if you perform well. And, I advocated that for both of my children. And they, it took a little fighting, but we got there. So I'm just saying the opportunities are going to be there. You've got to take advantage of them, and you've got to have hunger. The one thing that I do believe that the baby boomers of this country had that I have not seen necessarily in all the other groups is hunger. We knew what we didn't have. We knew that the only way to get it was to work. I've not seen that in my professional career with some of the other organizations, or not organizations, but millennials, Gen X, everything. I think I'll stop there.
Mr. Hart, thank you so much. Each one of your words carries a great gravity of wisdom and power. Before we moved on to the group discussions, I did have two individual questions for you based on some of what you shared with us today. So you said that even back in the day, middle class neighborhoods were a lot tighter back then. And there's definitely a lot of norms and values that we had at that time that maybe we need to revisit bringing those into the future. So my question is, what can we do to become closer as a physical community? It seems like today we maintain our long distance or our social media relationships, or care about what's being said on technology more than we care about our local ones. So what do we do about rebuilding, say if we're here in Virginia, rebuilding the Black community here?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. I think your analysis is correct. I believe that picking up the phone and talking to someone, or talking to someone face-to-face will always be more valuable than social media.
Yeah.
Now, social media serves a purpose. You can get a lot of thoughts out there in the middle of the night, schedule it to be delivered at 6 a.m. the next morning, and it'll show up in somebody's inbox, and you can get your point across.
Right.
But for communication and building relationships, I think the one-to-one, we've got to get back to more one-on-one, and we've got to know people. We've got to respect each other and be willing to help each other. That was the basis of the neighborhoods of the 60s. They're, the moms, the dads, we were all against the world, because, everybody outside of those neighborhoods was not willing to do anything for us.
Mm-hmm.
So it was us. We had to do it together. And I think somewhat of a return to looking out for your neighbor, looking out and building relationships, building neighborhoods has got to happen. And a lot of that, I still believe, has to be face-to-face.
Understood. And then you also articulated events that are happening in the past where technology was used as an enabler for discrimination, and you mentioned redlining and storing people's confidential information in databases. That's how IBM made their money. My question to you is more on the media side. So this is a conversation that you and I had this past Thursday. So what's going on with the Black mainstream media? It seems like it divides us. Not all of it, but there's the stuff that we see the most. It seems like it divides us rather than brings us together. When you listen to, some of the mainstream music these days, we talked about one in particular this past Thursday. When you turn on BET, you turn on the Hallmark Channel or VH1, you don't always see African Americans in the best light. You do see new progressive shows like people are big fans of Blackish or Grownish. You do see progressive shows like that, but across the board, it seems like we have a lot of work to do in terms of media and what messages or how we're depicting ourselves, because it's having a trickle down effect, I think, on the younger generations. So what's your perspective there?
It does. And it's the money talking.
Yeah.
We all know who drives the recording industry and who is driving the current media that we're seeing. Those things sell. I think it was Brother Wiggins that said that when we stop supporting those things that are not in our interest, they will begin to go away.
Mm.
And, it's, having, big topic for me, respect for women. The stuff that I hear, even on the basic cable shows. In fact, I was watching a rerun of a show last night called, I think it was called Bigger. And they were referring to the male anatomy and having to get it on normal cable. Just listening to that conversation, we have to stop. We've got to stop diving to the bottom. You got to bring yourself up. And if we can't do it as a people, we will always be controlled.
Gotcha. I did have one question that came in just now through the Q&A. I'll pose this to Mr. Harvey, but for everybody else in the group, I guess I'll open it up for a roundtable discussion. Do you feel that civic organizations such as the NAACP, Congressional Black Caucus, fraternities and sororities, et cetera, having a significant impact in the state of the culture? This is for everybody, but Mr. Harvey, I'd love to hear your thoughts first.
Okay, I do. That's the short and sweet.
Okay.
I've had the opportunity, of course, I'm a member of a fraternity in the Divine Nine. I was a member for 15 years of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation board. I know what they're trying to do. NAACP is trying to do the same things. We now have in many areas progressive leadership in organizations such as the NAACP. I think there's still a role for these organizations to help lead. It's a way that you can get together, you can express your thoughts, and I do think that they have a role.
Got you. Anybody else on that topic? So NAACP, D9 fraternities and sororities, like what's their impact on the state of the culture now?
Well, I'll just say this. Like I said before, I think just using your influence and trying to get other people in the room that with viewpoints and that could be beneficial for the culture. If I have, I mean, we have a brother Mr. Alcee Hastings, that's a Fisk graduate that's in the Capitol right now, and I'm going to meet with him and try to let him know what our viewpoints are, so that at the very least, that they know what's going on outside of the bubble that may be Congress. And beyond that, on a smaller scale, like I said before, like Mr. Harvey said, with the school boards, being involved in that, knowing what's going on in the schools, knowing what's going on with the PTA, knowing what's going on with on smaller elections. It's very important to have people that are with the fraternities and the sororities and the NAACP to have a seat at the table, as they say, to influence where these certain projects are going to take place. Like Mr. Harvey was talking about, alluded to the infrastructure in Buffalo, and how a lot of times when they put roads in certain places, they may not be beneficial to less than to Black communities, quite frankly. They may be detrimental to them because of the traffic that they may bring or may not bring. So understanding who is in the room, who is at the table, and trying to bring the NAACP and the Divine Nine, if they're used properly, if they use their platform properly, I'll say, can be very beneficial.
Gotcha. I wanted to stay with you, Mr. Wiggins, but I'll pose this question to the entire group. So this gets into the portion of the conversation I want to have now in terms of our agenda. Democrats have an agenda, Republicans have an agenda, the president, Senate, House, they all have an agenda. At the local level, they all have agendas. What should be the top 3 things on our agenda? You mentioned mental health and financial literacy earlier, and then maybe one more thing. What are the top 3 things that should be on our Black agenda? And then what are some examples of things that we can do ourselves, as well as examples that things that we need to be pushing our government for and pushing corporations for as well?
I'll say for me, because I'm very careful about not speaking for the entire generation. In addition to the mental health and the financial literacy, is establishing our own corner of what power looks like, and not relying on Democrats or Republicans or any kind of political party to dictate what's important for us. I think that we can use those who we put into power as long as they're benefiting us, and not just because they may be a Democrat or a Republican. I think we paint ourselves into a corner sometimes, to where we don't. The critical thinking may we get overutilized. We get taken advantage of, and that's probably part of where the cynical viewpoint comes from, because we don't follow through with, hey, if you're not going to do this for us, if you're not going to represent us in such a way, speak up for us to empower us with employment opportunities, education, so on and so forth, then I'm not going to platform for you. And far too long that's taken place. So I think that taking power, utilizing our power and establishing and organizing our power would be the third thing, in addition to mental health.
Excellent.
I'd like to
The top
co-sign
three
that.
things.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No problem. The top three things that we talked about a little bit earlier, the importance of mental health and making sure that you see a therapist as often as you see a doctor. We talked about financial literacy and making sure that you're building your wealth from an early on age, making sure that you have a corporate exit plan or a retire early plan as early as the age that you guys are now. And I like what you added, Mr. Wiggins, the third one, establishing our own nonpartisan political base of power that's not tied to any one particular political party, and just making sure that we're never again taken advantage of. Because when we vote as a block, when we vote collectively, and when we voice our opinions collectively, that can be something really powerful. So, Mr. Tree, I do apologize for cutting you off. In terms of your perspective as a millennial, what are the top three things that should be on our Black agenda?
So just to piggyback off of what Mr. Wiggins said, I think that one of the reasons why we're utilized but overlooked at the same time is because it's almost as if we're not forcing people to hear us. We're not forcing people to take us seriously. And money is power, right? And I think one of the important things is we have to find a way to flip the Black dollar over and over and over again before it leaves our community. And that means, taking some time to Google search the Black-owned restaurants in your area, the Black-owned clothing stores, or even grocery stores, or seeking services specifically from Black professionals, Black doctors, Black lawyers, Black accountants, right? That's how you force your agenda, by saying, hey, this is where my money is going to stay. And if you want it, you have to appease me and my mission. I think that is paramount in many respects. I also think that encouraging young Black folks to be engaged in politics, not just in terms of voting, but also in terms of seeking office, right? Whether on a local or regional or national level. Because I can say that one of the reasons why I wanted to go to law school is because I understood that the law is really only as good as the people who are willing to advocate for it as it currently is, or advocate to change it. So, and lastly, I would also piggyback on the health thing. I think nutrition, exercise, understanding what it means to live a healthy lifestyle, those things obviously play a very key role as well.
Awesome. And then, luckily for this group here, we actually have two conversations coming up. In March, we're going to be having our Money Matters webinar. We'll be talking about the fundamentals of investing and budgeting and making a retirement early plan. And then in April, we'll be having a total health webinar, but goes over, physical health, mental health, spiritual health, all of that. So we do have that programming lined up. Before we move on to the next question, Mr. Hobson or Dr. Hobson or Mr. Harvey, is there anything that you wanted to add in terms of the three top things that should be on our agenda for the next year and then for the future?
I'll defer to the elder statesman. I'm just listening to him, loving it.
Okay.
I think the only one that I would add is one that both Mr. Street and Mr. Wiggins have talked about, is involvement.
Right.
You've got to get yourself involved. If it means being the PTA president or vice president or whatever, you need to be in the schools. You need to be there. They need to know that if they do something wrong, you're going to be there to make them pay for it. You know, here in Loudoun County, we have principals who are racist. And I know I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. But we have principals in Loudoun County that are racist. And their assistant principals are racist. And they will implement their agenda. You need to be in the school. You need to understand what's happening to your children. You need to be driving what is going on. And as you move up, attend the school board meetings, get on the agenda. Make sure that when they're looking down off that podium, they see you. Damn, he was here, he was here last month. And see you every time and know that you care about the children. Because the only way we're going to change things is by getting in the middle of it.
Mm. Excellent. So let me get on to the next question. So we really do appreciate that, Mr. Harvey. So in terms of 2020, the biggest headline outside of the resurgent Black Lives Matter movement was obviously the coronavirus 19 pandemic. So my question to the not the audience, to the group, are what are the biggest generational lessons that coronavirus has taught us as a community? I feel like, this is some evil experiment where, none of us can communicate with each other. None of us can come within each other. We all have to stay masked up. But at the same time, we're all increasing our presence, with screens, whether it's TV or phones or laptops or whatever. And then people are more isolated. People are, spiraling. There's a lot that happened in the last year. So my question is, with everything that's happened last year, with all of the loss of life, with all of the changes in society, what's the biggest generational lesson that we need to take and apply for life?
I'll start off for millennials. I think millennials have had a false sense of feeling as though we have time, right?
Yeah.
We're young, we have time, so maybe in a year from now, maybe 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, that's when we'll get involved. Unacceptable. We don't have the time. We have to do it now, right? Because Generation Z is already here and they're looking at us. And so I think one of the lessons that millennials need to take away from the pandemic is that sense of urgency, again, that you can't just sit on the sidelines or else it won't get done.
Right. Anybody else?
I'll just say for Generation X, just a lot of us have families, just planning, proper planning for the unexpected. A lot of us have families and, maybe one or both may have lost a job.
Right.
And have had to be utilize whatever resources you may have. So we don't want this to happen again. So you're trying to plan, learn how to plan accordingly so that if it doesn't happen, great. If it does, you'll be ready. That's all.
Gotcha.
I agree with Mr. Wiggins that planning is key. I have never been in this bubble in my life, and I'm going crazy. I'm serious. It's when we get out of this, I am going to be a hugging and kissing fool. Probably get myself in trouble, but I'm going to be out there. I people that I have talked to, have gone out to lunch with, gone out drinking, done all those things. Always, I can't see them anymore. They can't see me, and it's tough. So I can't wait, but planning, having the foresight to make sure that you and your family are ready for emergencies. It may not be this emergency, It could be something else, who knows? But making sure that you and your family are ready to withstand things like this is going to be key. And I hope we all take that away.
Excellent. And this will be the last question that I kick to the group before I give it to Mr. Dr. Hobson to close us out. So the last question I have for the group is, who are the three most influencers? I'm asking for three, but each one of you can only just give one, and that'll give us our three. What are the three biggest influencers in 2021 that have the loudest platform? Who can be this generation's Martin Luther King or Malcolm X? Who is that person that if they spoke, we would all rally behind? That can help us, help us lead this groundswell and make sure that it's focused and it's targeted, and like Mr. Wiggins said, that we're getting stuff done and following through. Take your time. I can actually go first. So for this generation, we're seeing a lot of athletes that are stepping up. LeBron James comes to mind. Ever since the incident with the Clippers, I think people have been seeing him in a different light in terms of making sure that equality is fell throughout the entire sports world, making sure that beyond the sports world, that this message of equality is being preached everywhere that he goes. Anytime there's something that happens, LeBron is always one of the first people to comment on it from the sports world. And then, of course, with the school that he put up in Northeast Ohio, too. This is a guy that has a lot of clout right now outside of basketball. Businesses listen to him, governments listen to him. He has influence overseas. I think that this is one person that does have the pulse of what's going on and could lead us forward if that's what he wants to do beyond basketball. That's just one example.
So I'll go ahead and say that I know it's traditional for former presidents to kind of take a back seat, right? They don't want to step on the toes of the new administration. But in all seriousness, I think that one, we wouldn't have the president we have today without Barack Obama, right? And people can say all they want until they're blue in the face that it was, Biden's agenda was Biden. Listen, if he wasn't Barack Obama's vice president when he was vice president, I don't think, I think the 7 million voters gap would have been a lot closer, right? And so I think that President Obama, I would love to see him come back in some capacity to lead us. And I know my generation would listen. So,
Mr. Street, before the others give their take. So usually the norms, for those that don't know, usually the norm is once you've completed your term as president, that you do, like Mr. Street said, fade into the background. You're not stirring the pot on political matters. You're a moderate statesman. You support whatever the existing president wants to do. You support the welfare of the nation. Now, Mr. Street, let me ask you this. Obama is a family now. So between his wife and his two lovely kids, can we see a dynasty among the Obamas? I believe both of them should be Gen Z as well, both of the kids.
right. I mean, I would definitely love to see that. They're, highly educated young ladies, as well as his wife, highly educated woman. I would love to see that family just really come to the forefront in terms of taking us to the next step, wherever that is, or whatever that is.
Cool. Anybody else?
Sure, I'll speak up. I'm going to use names, but they really talk about groups. I'm going to start off with Stacey Abrams. I'm going to start off there because that young lady has the drive and the ability to organize and to take over things that I haven't seen in a long time. Now I said groups, Mayor Bottoms. She's, I think, of the same ilk. She just hasn't had the opportunity to do some of those things.
Mhm.
That would be the one person. I'm also going to give Ms. Montgomery, the former starting point guard for the Atlanta Dream, a hell of a lot of, there I go again, I'm sorry, a heck of a lot of credit. That young lady stepped away from her career when she believed that it was important. And she saw the oppression of her owner. Her owner happened to be a United States senator, and she organized the WNBA and many others to get LaFleur, or whatever her name is, out of the Senate and to get the good Reverend into that job. I give her. We need people like that. That's in the ilk of the LeBron Jameses of the world. However, she stepped away. She gave her career up so she could focus on making something happen. It's people like that that I also have a lot of credit for. And then the Roz Brewers of the world. Many of you don't know Roz. She's a Spelman College graduate. She is now, or at least next month, will take over the Walgreens corporation, which will make her the first female CEO of a top 50 corporation. Roz has done a lot of great stuff. She was Sam's Club CEO. She served on our board at Lockheed Martin. She is on the board of directors for Spelman College. People like that, I give a lot of credit for. Those are the future. And I would assume that she falls in the millennial age.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's those categories of people that I think are the ones that I admire the most.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Harvey.
I'll say, and I don't subscribe to having a leader, but I do think that we can have. Just like with most other movements, there's a multi-pronged approach. You have those that are going to be vocal out in front. You have folks that are going to do the paperwork. You have the folks that are going to make the connections to make sure that folks are where they need to be. I like the LeBron discussion because he can reach a lot of people, reach a lot of the younger folks. Stacey Abrams, you took her off my list, Mr. Harvey, because that's the organizational aspect of it.
Yep.
And I don't think that it's necessarily got to be a man. A lot of times we look back at the leaders and we think it has to be a black man that's doing it, but most of the time it's a black woman behind it, or that's running the boards. And Mr. Street, you spoke about former President Obama, and I believe that Michelle Obama has just as much, if not more, of a reach than he does at this point. So she can also be very influential. One wild card that I have, and I don't always agree with him, but he speaks to one of the points that I've brought up, is particularly with millennials, is Charlemagne. Because he speaks a lot about he speaks a lot about mental health and normalization of engaging and seeking out mental health services. So it's not just a matter of, if you seeing somebody, then something's wrong with you. Something's wrong with all of us in one way or another, but it's a matter of being willing to go in and work on that. So that's a wild card. But those are my little crew.
Gotcha. And then I do have one comment I did want to read out to you guys. You don't have to respond. It's just a comment. So I see Jaylen Brown from the Boston Celtics is a leader that comes to mind for the younger generation. So, okay, Jaylen Brown, if I'm not mistaken, he's 22 or 23, so definitely a part of Gen Z. plays for the Boston Celtics, all-star this year. He's very knowledgeable and active in promoting change, Black communities, schools, and financial literacy. So yes, absolutely agree. Okay. If I'm not mistaken, when the Black Lives Matter protests were happening, he was at the front of the charge in Atlanta. So yeah. So hey guys, really powerful discussion. Dr. Hobson, just 2 minutes just to close us off, and then I'll close off the sign us off for the webinar.
Sure
I know I
thing.
promised you 5, but we're trying to get it in 2. We're already at
No,
the
it's all
5 minute
good.
mark.
I would just add this in terms of leadership. I say Lance Farquharson is a leader, Miles Lee. I'm definitely going to listen to Kenton Moore, Joshua Reynolds, Donald Craig, and David Jenkins. I'm listening to those folks when they talk. So just to add a couple names to other leaders. So real quick, first and foremost, last Friday marks 9 years since the murder of Trayvon Martin. In 2 weeks, it will be the 1-year anniversary since the murder of Breonna Taylor. So we are in a precarious place right now, you all. We are dealing with things that have happened in the past that give us some indication of where we are in the present. And if we're not careful, we could see this again in the future. So had I responded to the question regarding the pandemic, I would have said, what I realize is that we are seeing an epidemic within a pandemic. And the epidemic was the killing of the Black body. Because we saw within the time of a pandemic, the unlawful murders of Black bodies, in addition to the disproportionate suffering of Black bodies. So I'm learning that we're not as far as we'd like to think we are in terms of progression, which I appreciate from Mr. Harvey laying out the groundwork and showing us from a personal narrative what it looks like and feels like to deal with some of those situations. But I'll say this, in terms of the state of the culture, I return to the theme of Sankofa. In terms of looking at our past to figure out where we are and where we're going, I say return to where we started, return with the ancestors, return with what our elders have taught us. For example, Mr. Harvey talked about his personal narrative. That's Sankofa. Those are days that he saw having to do with civil rights or denied civil rights in terms of housing, in terms of labor and economics. That's violence, folks. That's another form of violence. To be denied these civil rights is another form of violence. And this is a violence that our grandparents and our great-grandparents knew. So when we think about generational wealth and the way in which we've been denied some of these opportunities, it goes back generations. I'm also reminded of the fact that Mr. Harvey says that we are still a work in progress, which I agree with. I'm reminded of Mr. Street's community building emphasis, right? This idea that through tech and through protests, we can begin to work from where we are in order to take advantage of these opportunities using different skills, gifts, talents, and abilities. And in some ways, Mr. Wiggins spoke to that as well. But I love the fact that he used that theme of influx, because I agree. We go back and forth. And so anytime we like to think we made progress, there's always a reminder of what we're up against. But I love Mr. Wiggins' description of action-based consciousness. In other words, not only do we realize what's going on, but then we have to do something. And he did point out, again, the idea of everybody having a different role to play. So no matter what your talents or your skills or your gifts are, you have to do something. You can't stop with knowledge. You have to do something. All right. And then last but not least, two things. Last but not least, in terms of the first idea, again, I'm borrowing from my elder statesman, Mr. Harvey, and then some of what I heard from my others. We all need to respect Black women, you all. Respect Black women. If nothing else, Dulles-Leesburg Alumni Chapter looks to represent what it means to be Black men. And part of that representation means modeling for those youngsters out there, the ways in which we interact with the people around us, the people who love us, be it our spouses, be it our sisters, be it our nieces, daughters, etc. So remember to respect Black women. And with that mention of DLAC, I just want to say we would be remiss if we did not mention our pole marker or our president of Dulles-Leesburg Alumni Chapter, Mr. Ivan Johnson. So I just want to make sure that we shout out Mr. Johnson and shout out all the Divine Nine in Loudoun County, because through organization, we can impact the state of the culture today, but also for tomorrow as well. So with that, I just say thank you.
Dr. Hobson, thank you so much. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. What an amazing and powerful discussion. I was really entertained by hearing everyone's perspective regarding the same, events that we've all been experiencing in history. I hope that you, the audience, got just as much of this out of I did out of today's session, and that some of the topics that we hit on today strike home and encourages the continuation of the discussion around the dinner table and in your social circles. We appreciate everyone live taking the time out of your day to hang out with us. And then for those that are watching this recording on YouTube, we hope that you enjoyed yourselves too. We hope that you check out our other content on Capital League TV on our YouTube channel. Thank you guys. Let's keep pushing in 2021 and beyond. I hope that the State of the Culture 2022 address that we're well on our way, solving all of our today's problems, as well as tackling the ones that will inevitably rise tomorrow. See you next time. This is Hilton Cole of Kappa Alpha Psi, Guide Right of Virginia, signing off. Thank you. All right, let me stop the recording.